Good evening, and welcome to Born to Wonder, a virtual benefit event for Anselm House. My name is Dan Olson, Managing Director here. We are so excited to have guests from all over the Twin Cities and the world. Feel free to comment in the chat where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Well, we have prepared a virtual 3-course dinner for you tonight. Let me explain. First, as an appetizer, we'll share a video outlining why Anselm House exists with stories from our student and faculty community. Then our main course, the intellectual feast that you're here for, is a 45-minute lecture and conversation between Aleister Mcgrath and Alan Love. Finally, as a dessert, we'll share some opportunities to engage more even tonight. And we'll also announce winners of Dr. McGrath's book, Born to Wonder. So don't log off early. Now I'll be back for dessert, but for now I have the honor of introducing Anselm House's Executive Director, Bryan Bademan. Raised in Minnesota, Bryan holds a PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame with additional studies at Princeton, Regent College, and the Coulson School of Management. Prior to joining Anselm House in 2009, Bryan taught history at universities in New Jersey, Connecticut, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Under his leadership, Anselm House has become a leader in a growing movement of university-based Christian study centers.
Greetings. My name is Bryan Bademan, and I'm the director of Anselm House at the University of Minnesota. I hope in the next few minutes to give you a sense for why Anselm House exists and why we do what we do. Anselm House has a distinctive mission calibrated to the needs of modern universities like the U. I want to start by painting a picture of what it feels like to set foot on the University of Minnesota's campus as a first-year student. The U is just a massive institution, as you probably know. There are 50,000 students, including more than 5,000 new freshmen that set foot on campus each year. It's one of the nation's largest universities. We don't usually think of it this way, but it's kind of like a small city. And if it was a city, it'd be the most diverse city in the state. Students and faculty come from more than 135 different countries, and of course from all over the United States. But students encounter more than just cultural diversity here. The U has nearly 200 different majors and programs, and almost 4,000 faculty. The intellectual diversity is just as astounding. And of course, these forms of diversity are mostly a strength. Our first-year students are going to meet all kinds of people and encounter all kinds of ideas. Horizons will be expanded and assumptions challenged. You can't help but be stretched. And yet, it will come as no surprise that it's also an environment that lacks coherence. The modern university is now famous for its fragmentation. You've maybe even heard the joke. A university is a vast network of departments and schools held together by a common HVAC system. In classrooms and labs, we take things apart. We break our subjects down into ever smaller and smaller pieces. We critique and dissect. And the successes of this approach to knowledge literally drive our world, but they also make it difficult and sometimes even impossible to ask what holds things together or what it all means. Almost no one asks those kinds of big questions here. They're considered philosophical and religious questions, and for the most part, they're ignored or even discouraged. This makes the modern university a very difficult atmosphere for faith. It's not that there's often outright hostility, but it's like there's not air here for faith to breathe, especially in the public spaces and in the work of the university itself. And this means that most Christians in places like the U don't really ask the very basic questions about how their faith shapes their studies and their public lives. If they have a living faith, they keep it private, in the dorm room, or in the prayer closet. And they'll be left to wonder if Jesus has anything meaningful to say about the things that are increasingly mattering to them, their fields and their futures. So this is why Anselm House exists. We lament that the public university stifles the flourishing of Christian faith, and of course, of actual Christians. We believe Jesus breathes life into every square inch of creation, and Christian students get to explore that reality, but not if faith and learning are kept apart. So at Anselm House, we're in the connecting business. We connect faith and knowledge with all of life. For about 40 years, we've been contending that faith and knowledge belong together and are in fact separated at great cost to us as disciples of Jesus, to be sure, but also to the world we're called to steward. Now let me say a quick word about St. Anselm. A few years ago, we officially changed our name to Anselm House, largely because of this prayer, one of the most illuminating and discerning prayers in the whole Christian tradition. Unless I believe, I shall not understand. Here, in just a few words, Anselm captures the profound truth that if we try to understand anything apart from God, we'll miss what's most important about everything. In knowing the Creator, Christians actually know the most important thing about the world. And of course, this insight has massive implications for every field of knowledge. Now, rather than give you a rundown of our programs, I'm going to let our faculty and students explain our campus presence in their own words. Thanks for tuning in.
College can be a place of connection, learning, and discovery, a place where rich community is found and lasting friendships formed. But it can also be a place of disconnection and fragmentation for students. Christian students on a secular campus often struggle to integrate their faith with their studies, interests, and career plans.
The summer before my freshman year of college, I was starting to feel a little bit nervous that I wouldn't find a Christian community that I could really call home. I remember I went to my mom one afternoon and I told her, Mom, I really think I need to go to a Christian school to get the kind of faith formation that I'm looking for. And she really felt like she could find something for me to do at the University of Minnesota. So she got on Google and just typed in Christian organization, University of Minnesota. And the first thing that popped up was Anselm House.
At Anselm House, our focus is on helping students forge the connections that make both faith and college meaningful. The Colin McLaurin Fellows Program offers UMN undergraduate and graduate students a community in which to find these connections. It's an innovative program of Christian formation in the context of a public university. Fellows meet in small cohorts to explore the Christian faith, asking the central question of how they can live well in God's story at the university and beyond.
In my cohort, there's people who are vet students, who are PhD students in English, physics, and seeing them try to live out their faith in all these different jobs and careers they're going into has really inspired me and encouraged me that I can seek that in my own life.
Each cohort is led by an experienced instructor and lasts an entire year, so that students learn and grow together through rich discussions, shared meals, retreats, prayer, and fellowship. And these cohorts build upon one another for up to 3 years, so that friendship and learning deepen during a fellow's entire time at the U.
Come ready with questions. Think about what questions in your career you want answered, or how does God affect my life? How does God affect the stories that we're living in and around? And you will have people in which to consider them with. I can't promise all the answers in the world, but what I can promise is friends who want to dig into those questions with you.
Becoming a fellow is the best way to find a Christian college experience at the University of Minnesota. Dozens of Fellows alumni have said that it's the most meaningful part of their college experience, and we invite you to make it part of yours.
My name is Francis Shen. I'm a professor of law and a member of the graduate program of neuroscience at the University of Minnesota. At the University of Minnesota, I'm sort of an interesting character. I'm a professor of law and I teach things like criminal law and evidence, but in my research life I direct something called the Shen Neuro Law Lab, and we integrate neuroscience and law. Our motto at the lab is every story is a brain story. I think that's very much true. I also think every story is a God story and a whole bunch of other stories too, but the big idea is that the more we learn about the brain, the way we make decisions, the reasons that we and others sometimes do what we don't want to do or we can't follow the rules, all of those insights might have some implications, powerful implications for the law. Anselm House plays a really unique and distinctive role amongst the Christian communities on campus because it really thinks about integrating academic life with faith life. You know, I remember when I was a student, and I think for many students, whenever time you go to Mass or your faith sharing group, you kind of, well, I'm going to set my academic stuff aside and now I'm going to have my faith time, my religious time, my vocation time, and then I'll go back to my school time. And I think that's really something that is natural to do, even if it's, I think, problematic or challenging at a secular institution like the University of Minnesota. I think there is an opportunity here as the university rethinks and reshapes its mission, in part in response to COVID, but just also in response to changing times, as it always, continually does, and to think where in a public institution the role for one's religious identity is. We're at a moment, and I see it in my classes and scholarship, where identity is very central to our students' lives, to our university, but too often religious identity is not a part of those conversations. And Anselm House really, I think, can be the key player in fostering that dialogue and in empowering students and faculty to raise their voices. It's not an easy thing to do. And I'll say that from my own experience, it's been very helpful to have the Anselm House community, both sort of individually and collectively, in giving me the support I need to raise my voice. And one clear example is we brought Archbishop Hebda, the Archbishop here in the Twin Cities, to campus 2 years ago. It was the first time that he had come to campus. It was the first time that I announced to my faculty in a very public email to the faculty list that I was a practicing Catholic and a Christian witness, and that this was an important part of not just, I thought, the law school, but kind of our collective university dialogue. That was not an easy email to send. It would have been much easier to just sort of stay somewhat anonymous on that front. And I know that a lot of our students feel the same way, that it's difficult for them to speak up in class on certain issues. It's difficult for them to have a voice in certain, again, really important strategic decisions that the university is making. So I think Anselm House is poised, given its tremendous history and all the work and good things it's done so far, to play that role. And I think now is the time.
Now for the main course. You'll hear a bit more from Professor Shen at the end of our conversation, but right now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Alan Love, who serves as the John M. Dolan Professor of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota and the director of the acclaimed Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. His research focuses on conceptual issues in biology, especially evolutionary developmental biology, molecular biology, and paleontology. I often think of Alan's work as helping to clarify how different kinds of sciences and scientists think and come to their conclusions. And they do think differently. He's been a recipient of a number of major research grants, and for the last 2 years has served as a faculty fellow with Anselm House. Dr. Love will introduce Dr. McGrath.
Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure to be the host of this Born to Wonder Exploring the Intersection of Faith and Science event. Our guest is Dr. Aleister Mcgrath, who is the Andreas Idrius Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, as well as a Senior Research Fellow at Harris Manchester College, Oxford, and President of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He is widely known for his work on topics in Christian theology and its interaction with the natural sciences, which includes more than 75 articles or book chapters and 30 academic books, textbooks, and edited volumes. If you're looking for a good place to start, the 3 volumes of his Scientific Theology exemplify Dr. McGrath's scholarship. He's also published a number of books for a general readership that have been translated into 25 different languages. The book that brings us together today is Born to Wonder, exploring our deepest questions. Why are we here and why does it matter? And with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. McGrath.
Well, it's very good to be with you tonight. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's really nice to be able to join in with you in this very interesting discussion. So I thought I'd talk a bit about this book of mine, Born to Wonder. And the point I'm making is, it's almost as if we are made or meant to be asking questions. And this experience of wonder, I think, is very, very important as a starting point. When I was young, about 10 years old, I experienced a sense of wonder, and it made me want to study science. I experienced a sense of wonder, I think, in two areas. One was I was given a microscope by a relative of mine, and I was able to really begin to engage nature. Then I built myself a little telescope and looked at the night sky, and I felt very strongly this sense of wonder. I think it was wonder which really made me feel there's something so big, so spacious, so amazing about this universe in which I live. I want to try and understand it better. And so, if you like, my sense of wonder really propelled me towards being a scientist. I felt this is something where I would like to try and understand something which is captivating me. So wonder, if you like, was a gateway experience. It was something that motivated me to want to ask questions. It was something that made me feel this is something I would like to explore in greater detail. Now, at that time, I had no interest in religion at all. I did not understand religion, and I felt fairly benign towards it. I wasn't hostile, but as things progressed, I think I did become much more aggressive. In fact, by the age of about 16, I really became quite an aggressive atheist. I think there were several reasons for this. One of them was that I picked up this cultural meta-narrative that science and religion are at war with each other, which back in the 1960s was, very, very dominant. And so it said to me, look, if you love science, you've got to hate religion, end of discussion. So that, I think, influenced me in one way. But I think another way in which I was influenced is this. And that is that science, in effect, was rigorously evidence-based, whereas religion just seemed to me to kind of make things up as you went along. So I did feel this sense of hostility towards religion, which began to emerge when I was about 16. So I think I'm one of these people who really, by the age of 16, felt I had sorted everything out, and that religion really wasn't part of my big picture at all. So in effect, I prepared to go to Oxford University to study chemistry. My first degree was in chemistry. And then I did a doctorate in molecular biophysics. However, I was rethinking things as I went along. And one of the things I was beginning to realize was that perhaps my early atheism was not as evidentially secure as I had thought it was. And so I found myself beginning to feel that actually I need to revisit this question. And I think a number of things forced me in this direction. One of them, of course, was simply doing some work in the philosophy of science, beginning to realize that there were some serious problems here about the underdetermination of theory by evidence, the real question about how you can in effect construct a crucial experiment, and also, of course, historical evidence, which is basically the history shows us quite clear that scientists at a given time may have thought this is right, it was a dominant view, but then in 50 years' time, people moved on, believed something else instead. So how did I account for that radical change in science? As if you like, science is on a journey. This is what it thinks now, but we can't really predict what it's going to think in the future. And so to cut it rather long, I think not very interesting story short, I shifted from atheism to Christianity, and that was very exciting in many ways. And I think one of the things that really helped me to do this was reading C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and I have quite a lot in common. We were both born in Belfast. We both went to Oxford. We were both atheists as teenagers. Lewis stayed an atheist for much longer. And of course, we both discovered Christianity while we were at Oxford University. But hey, he's a humanities person. I'm a scientist. However, I began to get interested in this question of the relationship between science and faith. I think one of the questions really was, how could I hold these together? And I think, my friends would say, well, that they're not incompatible. You don't need to construct a theoretical framework. But I felt that it was really important not simply to be able to say, well, somehow I can make these hold together, but rather I need to offer a kind of theoretical framework to be able to do this properly. And I got one from a man called Charles Coulson. I'm not your American. Charles Coulson, of course, worked in Nixon's White House and had some excitement around the time of Watergate. This is Charles Coulson, who was Oxford University's professor of theoretical chemistry. He was also a very prominent Methodist lay preacher, And I heard a sermon he preached in 1973, I think, in which he talked about, in effect, science and faith offering different perspectives on reality. And the point he was making, I think, was that here is science, here is religion. They are different, but actually they're coming at the same bigger reality, and they offer us insights from their own distinct perspective, which are different. But in effect, you have to bring them together as part of a bigger whole. In other words, different perspectives yield different insights. And to give a full account of something, you need to find some way of integrating these insights. I quite liked that. I thought it was a very good start. I did feel, however, that more needed to be said. And that's why I began to get interested in the idea of science and faith engaging different levels of similar questions. In other words, you could ask the same question, and there might be a scientific answer to that question, there might be a religious answer to that question, but actually that's the way these things are. And these questions are not rendered invalid by the fact that somebody's answered this question previously. So it's a difficult point. Let me give you an illustration. It's not a very exciting illustration, but I want you to imagine that there's a kettle boiling. Okay, so the kettle is boiling. And the question you're asking is, why is that kettle boiling? Okay, here's answer one. Well, it's boiling because of energy conversion. The electricity is being converted to heat, water's raised to boiling point. That's why the kettle is boiling, and that's right. Except it's not the full picture, because somebody else might say, well, look, the reason why the kettle is boiling is I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. That's what we do here in England, by the way. And, you know, so there you have two answers. Energy conversion, wanting a cup of tea. Does the fact the first is right make the second wrong? Well, no. They are part of a bigger picture. I think that's a very important point. That in effect, you can give different answers which do not negate or contradict each other, but are rather part of a bigger picture. And that does seem to me to be a very important point. So that seems to me to be important. We can also think of science and faith mapping religion in different ways. So again, that's a way of helping us, gives a kind of theoretical framework. But I think the main point I want to make here is that we somehow need to find a way of holding together questions about how the universe functions and deeper questions about actually what is universe all about. And that involves, I think, beginning to have good understanding of what human nature is all about. And that to me is quite important, because we are in a social context where very often strongly reductive accounts of human nature are given. For example, someone might say that we are simply atoms and molecules. And, you know, I agree, you know, I am made of atoms and molecules, so are you. And actually, so is this glass of water I'm just about to drink from, because my throat's going dry. But the point I'm going to make to you is that that glass of water, like me, is made of atoms and molecules. But if you cannot tell the difference between me and a glass of water, there's something very seriously wrong with the way you're thinking. And one of the points I think we need to explore is how we're able to give an account of human nature which is scientifically accurate, but which doesn't actually reduce human nature simply to a collection of functioning units. I think that is a very important question. We're bigger than our individual parts, and somehow finding some way of holding these together is, to me, I think, really very important. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's very important to think more broadly, to welcome the insights that come, for example, from the natural sciences, but also to say, well, look, we need more than this to be able to do justice to us. I think one of the issues that really is interesting here is that there seems to be something about us which makes us ask these ultimate questions. And there are lots of places people who we might think of. I think, for example, of Sir Alister Hardy, who was professor of zoology here at Oxford back in the 50s, who just felt that there seemed to be something about us which made us feel that there was something beyond us that we really need to be engaging with. So the question then is how on earth we find a way of, in effect, bringing this side of things, if you like, engagement with the transcendent, into this way of thinking. And of course, there are also other questions that I touch on in this book, Born to Wonder, which I think are really important to us. One of them might be this: what difference does it make to us? You know, in other words, supposing we say, well, look, if you take a religious perspective, it does open up very important questions of meaning. Indeed, one of the things that religion does is to say we can talk about meaning and values and not simply how things function. What difference does that make to us? And psychologically, it does seem to make us more stable, more balanced, more rooted, if we feel we can see some kind of meaning or purpose in our world and in our lives. And so that naturally leads into questions like the link between spirituality and healthcare, where there is some evidence, it's not overwhelming, but it is, I think, interesting that actually having some kind of bigger picture about reality, which is very often a religious bigger picture, that seems to me to be important and in effect helping us to gain stability and mental health in these difficult times when actually these things are really very important indeed. So the book Born to Wonder is really raising some very important questions about how we hold science and a broader range of disciplines, including philosophy and certainly theology and spirituality together. But it also asks deep questions about how on earth we learn to live with the fact that some of these big questions, or Karl Popper calls ultimate questions, can be answered without making us into a very dogmatic people. And I wrestle with this question, especially towards the end of the book. And I engage particularly with an Oxford academic called Sir Isaiah Berlin, who I find very interesting. When I was a student at Oxford, indeed when I was a young academic at Oxford, he was very much a part of the Oxford scene. And he grew up in Eastern Europe, and he was very attuned to totalitarian ideologies that arose in the 1930s. And his basic argument was this: if you take an ideology, it lies beyond proof. But people get very attached to them. They become very committed to them, and that's actually quite dangerous. So we need to find some way of recognizing these are actually uncertain, that there's a debate about these. And his argument was we had to learn generosity towards each other because these things are not things you can prove. If I think this and you think that, it doesn't mean either of us is mad, but it does mean we are different. Somehow we've got to find a way of working with that difference. And so that explains why towards the end of the book, I begin to open up some questions about how we generate humility without losing traction on the truth. But there's one more thing to talk about before I kind of hand over for further discussion. When I was growing up in Northern Ireland, I was a Marxist when I was in my late teens. And I saw Marxism and atheism kind of ways going together and reinforcing each other. And I began to move away from Marxism as a worldview. I saw it more as a local tool of sociological analysis. But I was drawn to Marxism because I saw it as offering this big picture of reality. And look, there are various types of Christianity, and the type I really find exciting is what I find in C.S. Lewis's writing, where Lewis is really inviting us to think of Christianity as giving us this big picture. In other words, it's not so much individual threads, each of which is different, and you look at it individually. It's much more that these threads can be woven together. And when you weave them together, you get something that's bigger than individual threads themselves. In other words, if you like, it's a lens, a way of looking at things, which brings things into sharp focus. I find that way of thinking very exciting and very helpful. But I realize not everybody wants to go into it. Some will say, well, look, Christianity or religion is simply about salvation, or it's about spirituality or leading a good life. I tend to see it as having this rich, explanatory, intellectual aspect as well. Not everyone would agree with me, but it does give me a framework for holding together science and faith. And that's why I'm so excited to be Oxford University's Professor of Science and Religion, because that, in effect, gives me a professional stimulus to do something that I would find enormously intellectual interesting, which is simply say science and faith, major elements of our culture here in the UK, as in the United States. How can they talk to each other? What, if anything, can they learn from each other? And it seems to me that's a really good question to discuss. And that's what we're going to do.
Now it would be good for us to try and dig a little bit deeper on some of the themes that you've already raised and maybe a few others. So let's start with something about big pictures and multiple perspectives. You argue that part of the quest for meaning is seeking a big picture or overarching narrative, noting C.S. Lewis's reflection that I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Often it's assumed, that religions play this kind of big picture role, though some people talk of the scientific worldview. However, you also emphasize how crucial it is for us to recognize and take seriously multiple perspectives to affirm the complexity of both ourselves and the world. There's a seeming tension between these two ideas because it seems like a big picture is precisely not multiple perspectives, such as a view from science and a view from theology. Do you agree that these ideas display an inherent tension? And how would you articulate these in relation to one another in order to affirm both commitments? And perhaps more controversially, do we really even need a big picture?
Well, I certainly agree with you. These are well worth discussing. I think, let me begin, I think, in a very important place. When I was studying chemistry at Oxford, I specialized in quantum theory. And one of the writers I read was Eugene Wigner, his remarkable essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And Wigner says, look, why does mathematics work so well? There's no obvious explanation. And he began to develop this idea about 2/3 of the way through the article that what we need is a bigger picture which helps us understand why mathematics is so effective. It doesn't explain itself. Why? And that seems to me to be really, if you like, passing the explanatory buck. In other words, we want to try and find some grand unified theory of everything. And that's a human temptation. It doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's there. And therefore, for me, it's attractive to see if some way of finding a bigger way of thinking which somehow holds everything together and makes it coherent, so that what is otherwise disconnected and disparate somehow is seen as part of a bigger whole. So I think there is that tendency among us to try and find some way of homogenizing this. But what I want to say is that that is one trend. The other trend is something else, and that is we tend to homogenize by reducing to commonalities. In other words, what I mean by that is very often you'll say, well, look, this is very complex. Let's make it simpler by getting rid of this, or boiling everything down to the same level. So reality becomes very simple, but it's distorted, it's reduced. And for me, the big challenge is to find some way of finding this bigger picture, while at the same time respecting the complexity of nature and not trying to force in some kind of preconceived philosophical or theological mold. And that's one of the reasons why I find people like Richard Dawkins so interesting, because behind their empirical science, I see definite philosophical pre-commitments which are not really acknowledged. And those, in effect, are beginning to have an impact on the way in which they think about the natural world. So do we really need a big picture? Well, I guess the answer is we don't, but we find it helpful, or rather, the psychologists tell us a lot of people do. And maybe I'm one of those people. And I think there's an instinct to try and find this bigger picture, which is why we like reading detective novels so much, because that's the core plot behind so many of these things. What big picture explains all these clues?
So let me just chase that with a question about the multiple perspectives. So how then do we contemplate seriously multiple perspectives, especially maybe competing big pictures?
Yeah, I like that. And I think here's my beginning of an answer. It's the beginnings of an answer, okay? It's not a definitive answer. I think that we have to say that this is where humility comes into it. I would take the view, I used to be a scientist and now a theologian. I can offer a theological lens, but it's only a partial lens. It helps me in some ways, but not others. And therefore, I don't totalize it. I don't say this is the answer to everything. I say this helps me in this area, but I need help in other areas. I use different lenses. Now, I'm a great admirer of the British philosopher Mary Midgley, who talks about the need for different intellectual toolkits for different purposes. Each discipline has its own toolkit. It approaches things in different ways, gives different answers, but they're all appropriate. And therefore, in effect, to answer a big question, you need multiple toolkits. You cannot say, this is my toolkit and that's it. I mean, a very good example of this would be, look, supposing you're someone who takes a thermometer. If I want to see whether I've got COVID, I use a thermometer. And I might say, well, look, this thermometer works really well to my temperature. I'm going to use it for everything. Because the tool works there, it works everywhere. So the thermometer will tell me the meaning of life. Well, it's not like that. You've got to recognize different research methods from different disciplines. They all build up. And for me, that is a recipe for interdisciplinarity, which I very much welcome.
That's a nice way of capturing something that I definitely want to come back to in thinking about the interaction of different perspectives. Let's turn to a metaphor that you draw on in the book, The Balcony versus the Road. And there seems to be a persistent nagging that humans experience about their place or lack thereof in the cosmos. And you capture this in the book succinctly in talking of home and whether we should seek meaning in our sort of current affliction or recognize that we are in some sense in exile. The balcony and the road metaphor comes from John Alexander Mackay, which is the distinction of walking experientially along the road versus somehow observing it dispassionately from a balcony. And the latter is sometimes equated with a scientific orientation that's somehow more objective and maybe even necessarily leads to a disenchantment of nature, thereby rendering the walking path, the experience, somehow meaningless. However, certainly seems like it could also elicit wonder in taking that same orientation. So to what degree is it necessary for us to maintain a kind of balance between cognitively understanding, maybe the perspective of the balcony, and experientially appreciating the view from the road, the natural world, including ourselves? And maybe more urgently, how practically do we achieve that balance, especially since the quest for meaning is often interrupted, as we all know in the age of COVID, by uncontrollable and unexpected life events, including trauma and doubt?
I think that's a great question, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this and talk about it a bit more because it is such a rich area of exploration. One of the things I find puzzling and interesting is that as a scientist, I can look at the natural world and give perfectly good cognitive explanations of everything I see. There's a rainbow. I had one this afternoon. I thought, I know why it's there. But there was also something else in me and said, well, I know why it's there. It's still very beautiful. And it elicits a sense of wonder. So in effect, if I put it like this, knowing how things function actually does not rob you of this deeper sense that there's more to it than that. I think that is a very important point to make. I use this balcony road metaphor because it's very helpful in making the point that it would be wonderful if we could have this view from up top and see everything as it really is. Because when we are down here, we don't see it. We're struggling. We see only what's around us, and we're wondering what the big picture is. Somebody else might be able to see it, but we can't. And one of the points I'm trying to make is maybe we have to learn to live with the fact that we'd like to be able to see things fully, but we can't. And therefore we struggle. We are journeying, we're traveling, not being able to see the big picture fully and not absolutely sure what we're doing, but nonetheless trying to make the best of it. And so one of the points I think that this really brings out is how important it is for those of us who are journeying along this road to talk to each other about what we're experiencing, what we find helpful, how we look after each other. Because that, in one sense, is how, as human beings, we actually help each other survive and grow. So for me, that's very important. But you used the image of exile earlier. You know, I've been thinking about this in COVID because I cannot meet my students. I cannot go to my office. You know, I'm in exile. I cannot go to the places and the people I knew. And I find myself longing to go back to them, you know, in the sense of remembering them and talking to them on two-dimensional screens and really wishing we could have a cup of tea together, you know. So it is a very powerful image for our time, if I may say so, this idea of exile, being cut off from, and actually then being reminded how important relationality actually is to being a human being. It doesn't feel right to have this rather abstract relationship with other people.
So that is nice because it brings out that maybe initially when we were thinking about the balcony and the road, we're thinking about ourselves. Somehow I can look from the balcony or I'm walking on the road. But you've just brought in a nice perspective, which is that we really should think about ourselves on the road with others, sort of walking together. And that in fact, that walking together permits and sometimes even facilitates dialogue, whereby we share and give perspective to one another while we're on the road. And I think that's a really helpful thing to keep in view, because there certainly is a tendency sometimes, and especially under these circumstances of having to spend so much time away from others, of isolation and feeling like we're somehow alone. Now, another thing that the balcony and the road metaphor sort of picks up on is potentially a difference between a sort of objective versus subjective kind of experience. And many times people assume that the objective perspective is somehow a scientific one, and the subjective one gets associated with personal philosophies or religions or something like that. And I think that maybe it's worth highlighting that these categories, science and religion, are sort of assumed in most of our everyday conversation. And at times in the book, you use the categories. At other times, you encourage us to interrogate them. And those kinds of interrogation have also been encouraged by other authors, especially through tracing some historical genealogies of these concepts, such as Peter Harrison in The Territories of Science and Religion, or Brent Nongbury in Before Religion, A History of a Modern Concept. You extensively discuss in the book how the concept of humanism can be similarly interrogated with some historical perspective, especially with an eye to how it can nudge us towards a richer picture of the human condition that jointly emerges from humanistic pursuits, such as history, literature, philosophy, and empirical inquiry, like anthropology, evolutionary biology, or psychology. Do you think it's necessary or desirable to break down the categories of science and religion in order to secure that more capacious humanism? And if so, how might we do that in pedagogy, where most of our basic categories are formed and solidified, whether that's early on in primary school or much later, say, in university curricula?
Well, I think it's always important to remember that categories are human inventions for the purposes of convenience, for kind of way dividing complex areas up. And we mustn't assume that they are either absolute or permanent. And I think my concern would be this. I know enough about the history of science to know how medieval science mingled the objective and the subjective. In other words, we are overwhelmed with wonder at this world, but we think we can actually figure some things out. And they were not seen as pressing in different directions. They didn't say, hey, this is a scientific me, this is the religious me. It's just, this is me. And I'm experiencing both these things, and they're making me ask these questions. So what I'm worried about is that sometimes, if I can put it like this, disciplinary authoritarianism, it has to be this, and because it's this, it can't be that, in effect, closes down discussion. It closes off conversations, which actually we ought to be having. So for me, a discipline is welcome. It's a specialization, but it's not uniquely authoritative. We have to appreciate that. It's saying from this angle of approach, it looks like this, but there are other angles of approach. And maybe although I can see things you can't see, you can see things I can't see. We need to talk to see if we can see more than this. So for me, that is one of the very important things. I do feel that we have to respect the importance of individual disciplines, which always arise because this is an important research field using this method. But the problem is that very often, in effect, they become intellectually isolated. And that I think is risky. So for me, talking about humanism, humanism is about making human beings flourish, trying to understand how we live optimal lives. And for me, religion is a very important part of that. Not everybody would agree, but that's the way I see it. But I think it is very important for someone like me who says religion is very helpful to say, well, what else is in the mix? How do we kind of widen out this discussion? So in many ways, one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to say, we welcome everybody to the table, but we have to listen, and we have to realize that our own disciplines, though important to us and important anyway, might not always be able to answer these questions. We might need to learn something from somebody else.
So do you see that manifesting in education in any distinctive ways? Is there sort of habits of learning that students might be trained in to help them know when they need a different perspective, or to sort of recognize limits and the need to cross boundaries?
I think one of the things that helps this is for students of the sciences to be able to talk to students of the humanities and actually try to understand the quite different approaches. And I think that one of the difficulties we have here in the United Kingdom is that in high schools, students are taught science as a body of definite knowledge. We do not really have this idea. It's a method, and its outcomes are provisional. They may change over time. It's about critical thinking. Very often that isn't there. So you have this idea that science is about learning a body of definite information. And I think we need to have more about how we get to know what we know, because that helps to understand why knowledge changes and where it can go wrong.
So I think that's a nice commentary on the fact that our current educational structures maybe don't do such a good job of facilitating some of those patterns that you were suggesting we should adopt. I guess I wonder if, not to call on you to look too far in the future, but do you think that we're on a path to improve that, or do you think that some of these problematic structures are maybe pretty strongly entrenched?
I think we have a problem. I think there's real pressure to deliver information that is useful in the marketplace. That in effect, we're dealing with an education system which very often is concerned with getting people into employment. They need a definite body of knowledge. And I fully understand that. But if I don't know why you think that, how can I say you're wrong? How can I say I'm wrong? We need to understand the methods by which we arrive at things, because that's how we correct things when they go wrong.
So you mentioned a moment ago the humanism in terms of flourishing, and sort of a picture of how as humans we might develop in our capacities. And I think that brings us to another theme in your book about human nature. And in your treatment, you quote Jonathan Glover, who says, "We need to look hard and clearly at some of the monsters inside us." And that reminds me of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's comment in the Gulag Archipelago that, quote, "the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Now, you nicely illustrate this point through examples from scientific researchers, such as Louis Frederick Pfizer, the Harvard biochemist, who was the first to artificially synthesize steroid cortisone and vitamin K, but also worked with the US Army to invent napalm. So this kind of chastens overly hasty appeals to progress that we might want to invoke, and maybe that we would be privileged at our particular place in history in terms of, say, a moral compass. So probably giving us a good dose of realism about our predicament. Now, as you highlight in the Christian tradition, this mixed heritage is not derived from our material constitution or our environmental context, but a combination of a gift, the image of God, and a curse, sin, as a consequence of the fall. So how do we make sense or secure meaning in the situation where we are in a pluralist society with disagreements regarding the origin, character, and extent of this mixed heritage? Lots of interpretations of this situation. And in addition to sort of how do we make sense of it, how do we then develop those capacities to flourish in light of a more sort of realistic anthropology, and especially going back to the point you highlighted earlier, that it's not done in isolation, but in community?
I think there are a lot of very good questions there. I'm sure we're going to be talking about them later this evening. But I think one of the points I want to make is that there's a real need to be realistic about human nature. The danger is we idealize ourselves and end up, I think, being completely unrealistic about what our limits are. Richard Dawkins and I disagree on quite a few things, but actually, when you read his book, The Selfish Gene, I mean, he one of the things he's saying is that in effect, we have some sort of genetic predisposition to be selfish. Now, obviously, you know, we can argue about whether he's right, we can argue about whether he overstates, but you can see he's saying, look, If that is so, then we have to be realistic about this. We have to say there's this bias within us, which actually affects us in so many ways. And of course, from a Christian theological perspective, sin is very much saying there's this bias within us. We are not, if you like a pair of balancing scales. They're perfectly in equilibrium. So you can weigh out this is good, this is evil. We're skewed. And that, I think, does, in effect, alert us to the dangers of a number of things. One is individual judgment may not be right at all. That's very important. It also means that actually committees might not be right either, because very often if you bring people together, you don't get wisdom, you get kind of the curious dynamics that emerge in committees. But I think that the main thing I want to bring out very clearly is this. If human beings are prone to error, prone to bias, prone to hidden agendas they don't fully understand. I know Freud is kind of way seen in slightly more negative ways these days than it would have been 30 years ago. But nevertheless, he's saying that we're not always conscious of the forces that move us in certain directions. And we have to realize that anything that we human beings do, whether it is science, whether it is religion, whether it's government, there's going to be all these biases and things in there. And therefore, these things might be very good, but they can also be very bad. And it's really, I think, a very significant warning against some kind of idealization. Anything that human beings do can go very badly wrong. It can also go very well. But there is this mixed aspect of what we do. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to be really realistic here and avoid these rather pleasant utopian diversions, in which we think we can kind of way make things perfect. If we're in charge, we're going to mess up. And that's important for thinking about things like transhumanism and the genetic modification of humanity. Because if that goes wrong, we are in trouble.
So in your musings at the end of the book, you highlight three principles: humility, generosity, and wonder, that can be distilled from your analysis of our search for meaning. I wonder if you could take a brief moment and summarize why these three principles in particular are crucial for us to concentrate on at this moment.
Well, I mentioned these three. I'm sure we could easily extend this list, but as I was doing the research for this book, these three themes kept coming back to me. Humility, because I don't know all the answers. If I pretend I do, I'm deluding myself and deluding everyone else. And it's a question of trying to say that, in effect, we need to think in terms of a shared knowledge, where, in effect, we are open to criticism from others, our own perceptions, our own grasp of reality may be imperfect, it may be flawed, and dialoguing with others helps us to sort ourselves out, and maybe it helps sort others out as well. So humility, for me, is just about being realistic about our limits. I also talk about generosity. What I mean by that is, in effect, saying, well, look, I think this, but I might be wrong. And therefore, generously, I work on the assumption that this person who has an idea which I think is mad may have seen something I've missed, and I want to find out if that's the case. In other words, taking others seriously, even when I might be predisposed to say this is clearly not right. But I think the sense of wonder is where I began the book and where I end up, really, because wonder is really saying there's almost something within us which is not it's not commodified, it's not monetarized. There's something within us which is saying there's a deep urge to engage and understand, because this is so wonderful. And so what I'm saying is we need some way of keeping that sense of wonder alive, because it's so important to making us intellectually curious, to exciting us. And in many ways, I'm just saying we really need to find a way of keeping that sense of wonder about the complexity and beauty of life alive. Because if you like, it's a gateway, it's a wellspring which keeps science and the humanities going.
Thank you. That was really a nice sort of encapsulation of the themes from the books. And I wonder, in bringing our conversation to a close, if you might share with us a few thoughts about how maybe both those in the academic trajectory, but also those more broadly, could have habits that cultivate wonder rather than stultify it.
I think that is very interesting. First of all, let me say how much I've enjoyed our conversation. It's been very, very interesting, and I very much appreciate the questions that have been asked. I think that one of the things I think we need to do is to, in effect, step outside our professional disciplines from time to time. I have a friend who's unfortunately dead now, but he did this. He went to live in Switzerland for a month up in the Alps, and he watched the birds. He watched the weather. He looked at the trees. He looked at the mountains, and he just kept saying to himself, "It is so wonderful. I am here to observe these things, to be impressed by them, to in effect be alive at this moment and take all of this in." In other words, he was deliberately saying to himself, don't take it for granted. Enjoy everything, appreciate everything. Watch that bird, look at that tree, look at that mountain. And actually, what he was doing really is cultivating attentiveness. In other words, deliberately looking closely at things that normally you would just pass by. I have found that helpful. In effect, deliberately slowing down, deliberately looking at things that otherwise I might not take a look at. For example, here in Britain at the moment, we have the most beautiful, we'd say, autumnal colors on trees. I don't know why it is, but instead of just saying, oh, it's nice, you stop and you look and you appreciate and you say, that's wonderful. And then you might make a reference, for theological reference. Thank you, God, for putting that there. It has its beauty in the midst of a very difficult time. So I found slowing down and deliberately being attentive to what's around is one way of beginning to deal with the issues we've been talking about this afternoon.
Thank you. That's really good advice and a great note to finish on. Let me be the first to really thank you for giving us this time and sharing your perspective and having what I think was a quite productive conversation together around some really important issues. And I want to thank all those who have the opportunity to watch us. And we hope that this will have been a benefit to you and been enlightening and possibly even suggestive of new reading and new habits for you in your own life. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Love and Dr. McGrath, for that rich conversation. Before we turn to dessert, we have some thank yous, some free books, and the option to keep engaging. A thank you first to our virtual table hosts. Do be checking your mailboxes for a thank you from us. Also, a thank you to Dr. Peter Mercer Taylor, Professor of Music at the U of M. Thank you for permission to share the beautiful choral music tonight. Learn more about Dr. Mercer Taylor's work at AmericanClassicalHymns.com. Finally, a huge thank you to our current supporters. Your generosity and dedication sustains our mission. Listen again to Dr. Francis Shen share why he and his family support Anselm House.
Our family gives to Anselm House because we believe deeply in its mission and because we see the real value in the contributions we make. There's direct effect from our support in the lives of especially students on campus. And there are so many, of course, great options for giving, and we give to our other religious commitments as well. But Anselm House is unique in that I know that every dollar I give to Anselm House, because I see it, because I'm a part of it, is going to support students here and developing their Christian lives and their ministry on campus. It's a great payoff. And the resources are needed. And I'll just add that I see a lot of other opportunities at the University of Minnesota to give, but none is more important to me than this.
If you'd like to join Francis in helping connect Christian faith and knowledge with all of life at the University of Minnesota, we invite you to get involved through learning, volunteering, and giving. If tonight is your first introduction, someone from our team will be in touch to hear what you thought and to see if there's any way you could get involved. If you've been connected for a while but you've never given, would you consider becoming an Anselm Associate or a Fellows sponsor? As of tonight, we are still asking God also for 7 gifts of $10,000 and 3 gifts of $25,000 to reach our $700,000 annual fund goal. Now, for free books. In the chat to your right, we're sharing some of your names. Take a look. If you see your name, you've won. All you need to do is email us at the email listed to claim your book. For the rest of you, if you do happen to become a first-time supporter between now and December 31st, we'd love to also send you a copy of Dr. McGrath's Born to Wonder, just as a token of our gratitude. Finally, for dessert, you might still be hungry to keep this conversation going. You can do this on your own with friends at your house or over Zoom, but you can also join a live Zoom room right now facilitated by members of our Anselm House community. Just click on the Zoom link now, and we'd love to see you live. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and God bless you, and good night.